President Biden just did something about immigration. He had to. As it stands, immigration is a Republican issue to win on. Biden had to act or concede his defeat at the polls. Biden says his new measure will end the colossal illegal flow of migrants which exploded during his administration. In the last 3 months of Trump's administration, there were about 72,000 encounters with people crossing the border unlawfully a month. But 5 months into the Biden administration, those encounters exploded to over 200,000 a month. And encounters finally reached a high of almost 302,000 in December 2023. Everyone knew something had to be done. After dithering for 6 months, Biden announced he was using his existing authority to prevent migrants who cross the southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. That sounds straightforward, but the details of his plan are complex, poorly understood, and probably in flux as we speak. And Biden's action is already being shot at by many who say it is ineffective as a policy measure, and by the ACLU, which says it will sue to block its implementation. While that is all hashed out, it's a good time for us to step back, catch our breath, and take a look at the whole structure of the national debate about immigration. We all know what the national debate sounds like. The debate is in the hands of the left and the right. The left insists on open borders. The left insists that migrants are fleeing desperate misery and cruelty. And for us to deny them entry to our country, to deny open borders to all who come, is despicable cruelty against desperate human beings. And the right, led by Donald Trump, says immigrants are criminals. When not criminals, they steal our jobs and endanger our paychecks. It is sheer insanity to let them in. Left out of that argument are almost all of us. We know that the rhetoric of the left and right are too extreme and unrealistic, but we lack ammunition for the debate. Why exactly are they too extreme? And once we move beyond the sterile left-right slugging match, what would a serious discussion of immigration sound like? Once the false issues are left behind, what does the real discussion sound like? I'm speaking today with Hein de Haas, who just authored How Migration Really Works, a stunning and deeply necessary work guaranteed to blow your mind. De Haas is here to unsettle you, to challenge everything you thought was right and everything you knew was wrong, and to offer you a new framework to think about migration. Hein de Haas, welcome to the Political Conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Why don't we dive right in? Let me ask you what must be the simplest and most difficult question. Why do people migrate?
Well, of course, people migrate for many different reasons, but the single most important reason for migration has always been people seeking for new opportunities, and particularly work. And what we very clearly see is that all wealthy societies in the world have significant levels of immigration. So if a country is doing well, the economy is doing well, generate a lot of demand for all sorts of labor, and that's when people come in. So it basically is a sign of prosperity. And we think that most people move because of, certainly nowadays, because of misery and problems in origin countries. And that may well be the case, but most people wouldn't show up at the border, wouldn't cross borders, wouldn't go through the effort of migrating if they hadn't a real prospect in the countries they go to. So it is really, of course, there's many other reasons. People may join family members, we have refugees, but the bulk of migrants really comes for work, basically.
Well, that's your conclusion. How do you back that up in your recent book?
Well, if you look at the history of migration, you clearly see that the demand for labor has always been driving force. If you, for instance, look at the United States, if you go back to 1942, there was a huge labor crunch in the US during the war effort. And that's when the US concluded a recruitment agreement with the Mexican government to get Mexicans to the United States. So this was not something that just happened to the US. It was actively put in motion, and you could say the same about Europe with their guest workers they got from Southern Europe, from North Africa, from Turkey. So most big migration started with active efforts to recruit. And another piece of proof is the quite close correlation between economic growth and immigration. So again, when the economy is doing well, lots of migrants come. When the economy is doing bad, not many people will come, many people will go back. And that's why I sometimes half-jokingly say the best way to really stop migration is to wreck your economy. And there is a fundamental truth in that.
So looking back on the United States' recent history, we're currently in a period where the economy is surprising everyone with its strength, and the immigration figures would seem to justify your conclusion right now. Does that follow for you?
Definitely. We've seen over the last decades, more in general, a rising trend in immigration, not just to the US, but also to many European countries. And it is partly linked to the fact that we've been through quite a long period, apart from some hiccups like the global financial crisis, through quite a long period of steady economic growth. And secondly, there are other factors in play, which is aging, growing skill levels of the native workforce, the rise of the two-income household, which means that for many reasons the demand for all sorts of jobs, higher skilled, lower skilled services, have increased. And we clearly see that, for instance, after the COVID crisis, which led to a spike in unemployment, that after the COVID crisis was over, we see a huge labor crunch. And labor shortages have reached an unprecedented peak in the United States, with vacancies topping an unprecedented 10 million in 2023. And that partly explains why migration has been increasing so fast over the last 2 years.
And looking back to the global economic crisis, what happened to immigration in the United States during that period?
You see a hike in unemployment for a few years, a slowdown of economic growth, and also a slowdown of immigration, both legal and illegal. So you again see this very close correlation between how well the economy is doing and overall levels of immigration. What you also see is that there is a negative correlation between the number of legal admissions and illegal migration, and that has particularly also played a role in the huge rise in border crossings over the last 2 years, because legal admissions have gone up, but not as fast to keep sort of track with rising labor demand, and that's another factor why illegal migration has been going up. So there's also a correlation between that. And the rises in illegal migration often reflect a lack of legal channels to migrate when labor demand is high. So both are related in a way to the state of the economy and the labor market.
I think our comments here just are making me remember the story of my Italian grandfather, Antonio Nuzzo, who was raised in Dorizzano, a hill village just outside of Naples. And Antonio emigrated to the United States in the late 19th century during a period of economic expansion, and literally went back and forth between Dorizzano and the United States on ship after ship. The family story is he'd make some money in the United States, go home to Dorizzano, brag, and impress all his friends with how well he was doing in the new country, and then go back to the United States and work like crazy and raise a family. And his work in the family legends and stories was described as wire mill worker in Connecticut, or building libraries funded by Andrew Carnegie, construction worker or factory worker, late 19th century, but so confident of his economic situation that he would migrate back and forth to Italy.
Yeah. That's the typical pattern of migration. If borders are open, which they were at the time, around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, migrants tend to go back and forth. We saw exactly the same with Mexicans coming to the US until, let's say, the 1980s, when it was very easy to cross borders. So natural migration, as migration scholars would say, is circular. That is what you're describing, people going back and forth. It's like moving within a country. What happened after 1986, and some very good research has been done on this by the sociologist Douglas Massey at Princeton. He's run a whole series of surveys for decades on Mexican-US migration. When the border was closed, and this actually happened after the first major reform immigration reform pursued by Ronald Reagan, who provided amnesty to 2.7 million undocumented, mostly Mexican migrants, we started the era of growing border enforcement, the building of fences along the border, growing investments in border surveillance over the Clinton and Bush administration. So it wasn't really Trump that built the wall. In a way, it's been a long, ongoing process. What it has mainly done is stop people from going back and forth. It hasn't so much stopped people from coming in because the opportunities are still there, but people no longer went back. In other words, it pushed people into permanent settlement. And when people decide to settle permanently, they will bring over their families. So the paradox is that these ill-conceived sort of measures that probably cater to political goals to win the next election, to show off that you're tough on immigration, often backfire. And clearly this is what happened in the US. So it basically turned a largely back and forth movement of Mexicans who went to California, Texas, a few border states to do agricultural work or work in construction or some services into a permanently settled population. And so what you say is right. Normally migration is very much a matter of going back and forth. To a certain extent, those policies have not only been ineffective, but also have backfired because they didn't take away people's motivations to move. And this was still that there are still jobs in the US. You can still earn a much higher wage than you could earn back in Mexico or these days in Central America for the same kind of work.
So let's turn from that to the opposite, the polar opposite kind of view that there really is, there are no concerns about immigration whatsoever. It's inevitable, and it ends up lifting all boats. The optimistic take that we hear from a lot of advocates who are advocates for immigration. You don't quite follow that belief. Can you explain your view?
Yeah, I think the main problem of the debate before I get into this issue is the framing. Because the facts are there in the sense that there's been decades of good research on migration. The problem is the polarized framing in a sort of pro-anti sort of camp, and this is also what I address in my book as the main problem. Because what happens is that the pro-camp hugely exaggerates the benefits of immigration, and the anti-camp hugely exaggerates the downsides of immigration. So to pick up the issue you're addressing, the economic impacts of immigration, it is clear from research that the idea that immigrants take away jobs or massively drive down wages simply has no basis in research. So that sort of allegation isn't backed up by evidence. In other words, migrants come to fill vacancies rather than take away jobs from native workers. On the other hand, so there's no real big effect of immigration on wages, for instance, or unemployment. It's rather that labor scarcity drives migration and then migrants fill in those jobs. On the other hand, if you look at who benefits most from immigration, whether you look at evidence in the US or in other big immigration countries like Germany or the UK or France, it is clearly that the already affluent benefit most from immigration. So these are not only the business owners, but these are also higher middle income families, high income earning couples that benefit from immigration because of the services that migrants provide in and around the house. Also think about the whole hospitality sector, think about the products you buy in the supermarket, who is picking the vegetables, who is slaughtering the animals in the slaughterhouses of the UK, of the US, etc., etc. So it is primarily people taking off those services that benefit most from immigration. The lowest income earners, let's say the bottom 10 to 20% of income earners, clearly doesn't benefit from immigration at all, and in some cases they may lose out. But it is not really the economic impact that I think it is the most important. It's typically also those populations that see the daily consequences of immigration in the neighborhoods or towns in which they live. So you could say that economic elites benefit most from immigration economically, and although lowest income earners who've already lost out in many ways from this whole era of liberalization and globalization over the last decades, which is not the result of immigration, but at the same time, these workers do see the day-to-day consequences, which are not always positive. So for them, there are also reasons to say, well, what's in it for me? And that is a big conclusion I tried also to draw in my book, is that we need to balance it out. We shouldn't only look at migration as an economic phenomenon, but also how it affects the daily lives of people. And actually the interesting fact is that former migrants are the ones who may feel most threatened by new immigration, because they often do work in exactly the same jobs as migrants are doing. And this can also explain the interesting phenomenon that former migrants often turn against new immigrants.
You tell a story in your book to make concrete the theories that we're dealing with. The story of Albertville. Could you pause and just give us that story once again?
Yeah, that's a beautiful documentary that has been made by This American Life. This American Life, a public radio program and a podcast. And this documentary was made, it's called Our Town. It was made by journalists Ira Glass and Mickey Meek, and it talks about a particular small town in Albertville. And if you look at the last few decades, it has gone through extraordinarily fast changes due to immigration. Back in 1990, 98% of this 15,000 strong population of Albertville was white. And if you go back just 20 years later, 1/4 of the population of the town had become Latino through the arrival of thousands of migrant workers, primarily from Mexico, but also from other Latin American countries. And this was because of changes in the local economy, because the local economy had been changing already from the 1960s because of the establishment of chicken processing plants in Albertville, which drew in initially mostly white workers from surrounding farms who were looking for other jobs. But that changed in the mid-1990s when more and more Latino workers were arriving, and that changed the whole life in the town in a relatively short period. And it created a lot of resentment among local workers who felt resentment towards the employers because they suspected them from secretly encouraging illegal immigration of Latinos, although most workers were actually not Latino, were not undocumented migrants. But it caused a lot of social change as well in the town, because people were witnessing that people came in with different lifestyles, they didn't perhaps adhere to the same kind of values, and it created a lot of unrest initially, and also, as I was mentioning, resentment against employers. The real causes of this increasing influx was, again, due to the fact that new generations of, let's say, the children of those factory workers generally were higher skilled, no longer wanted to work in the chicken factories, and employers started to look elsewhere for labor. So, and some research has been done also on this particular case, showing that yes, local workers did lose out a little bit, also economically, although it wasn't the biggest reason why people were not happy about the situation. It was more that they had real feelings of alienation and annoyance by the fact that they suddenly couldn't speak English anymore to many of their co-workers. When Latino workers started to really move into town, they would park cars in front of yards and leave garbage cans and trash on lawns, destroying the grass. And they perhaps weren't as much interested in maintaining, a perfectly front lawn. So this created a lot of unrest because of this rapid change. And it also led to the election of a new mayor on an anti-immigration platform. But the interesting thing is, after this period of high tensions, things reversed course. When kids started going to local schools, there were a lot of initiatives, and initially and later on it led to a sort of growing understanding between those groups. But what this case, I think, shows is that if you only focus on statistics and make this argument that migrants don't take away jobs, which was clearly also in the case of Albertville not the case, because workers mostly filled in vacancies, it is, of course, for local workers who still work in those factories, a real fast change. And if you've been living and working there for your whole life, it may be difficult to adjust to that change, and it can lead to real annoyances. Although, so the big stories about migrants taking away jobs or ramping up crime rates are all not sort of supported by facts, but just focusing on these sort of big statistics could make us blind for the real changes migration can bring, and certainly in the short to medium term, also changes that can be quite unsettling for people who've been working and living in places for decades. So I think we need to take that into account, that not for everybody the story is the same. The story for migrants is yet another one, of course, because for the migrants it means a life-changing opportunity. What I also found interesting about the documentary is that many local workers could empathize with migrant workers in the sense of them trying to provide a better future for their families, working hard. They all could understand that. And the resentment was often stronger towards the employers because people felt left alone by the employers because wages hadn't been going up for many years. In terms of real purchasing power, actually people often are worse off than 20 to 30 years ago. This is not a result of immigration, it's a result of change of economic policy, growing inequality more general in the United States. But on top of that, people see their daily lives completely changed. So indeed, they may have good reasons to ask, so what's in it for me? So I think when governments think about immigration, let's not just think of it as an economic phenomenon, or let's not just consider migrants as a handy workforce, but let's consider them as people and think about indeed questions of how do people settle, how do we make sure that everybody benefits from migration and not only the already better off in societies.
So we have in America been debating what's been happening to our middle class, in particular the sort of the lower levels of the American middle class, for 30 going on 40 years, and watching a steady deterioration of the kind of security that many families once enjoyed. And what you're saying sounds like our failure to really deal with that is part and parcel of the growth of immigration into the United States, and that to try to isolate either of those issues will be fruitless. The two issues are intertwined.
Yes, I mean, migration is not the cause of the problems you were evoking. It is neither the solution. So the pro-immigration camp tends to represent migration as a solution for instance, aging and lack of productivity and all sorts of other reasons. Migration would be something fantastic. And the anti-immigration camp tries to basically shift the blame towards immigrants for indeed growing insecurity, social and economic insecurity for even middle-income earners in America, which is not caused really by immigration, but of course it makes it very attractive for politicians. The same politicians who've been pursuing those reforms over the last 4 decades, both Democrat and Republican. It becomes, of course, attractive to shift the blame to immigrants, and that is a very old impulse that we've seen throughout history, both in the US but also in Europe, that when the going gets tough and politicians, in a way, don't want to reverse course in terms of economic or social policies, it is the easiest way is to say, well, it's because of immigration. So immigration is not a solution, it's also not the cause of the problem. But the political impulse is, of course, very strong to play the immigration card.
So let me ask the impossible question. You're laying out a persuasive interrelation of these two issues, but in my country we have bluntly failed to deal with the dilemmas of the middle class. What do we do to make progress in that area?
Well, that requires a change in economic and social policies. I mean, we talk about taxation, we talk about labor law, we talk about protection of workers, we talk about affordable housing, a whole series of issues that are, of course, highly controversial in the United States. But these are, of course, the whole politics of liberalization, which we've seen since the Reagan era. have, of course, made lives of middle-class families less secure than they used to be. Also think about education. I think it's a very important concern for many people. The fast rises of costs of higher education, the fact that students nowadays are confronted with huge debts, the insecurity also in terms of getting access to affordable housing gets more and more difficult. The only way to solve that is make changes in those policy areas, in housing, taxation, labor protection. All these sort of areas have actually not that much to do with immigration, although you could say that we have created this, what we often call the gig economy, the platform labor market. We've created so many jobs that are so insecure that it is mainly migrants who still want to do those jobs because they're simply too unattractive for native workers. And of course, if you would make jobs more attractive, you wouldn't take away migration, or you shouldn't create any illusion that in the future there will be no more migrants, but you may, of course, hypothetically, I think it's quite likely that you may motivate more native workers to pick up certain jobs that right now are not seen as attractive because you simply don't earn enough wages. So migration is part of a much bigger debate about how do we deal with labor, how do we deal with aging in the future, how do we deal with job security. And I think all these issues are interlinked. And what we could say is that successive governments, administrations have given the control instruments out of hand in terms of immigration. We see a huge hike also in the United States of temporary admissions, which actually reached an all-time high under the Trump presidency. Not many people know this, but in a way, governments have been very willing to let in more immigrants as soon as employers snap their fingers. That is the basic reason. Or have tolerated the deployment of undocumented migrants. I mean, one of the statistics that in a way shocks me most is that, completely in contrast to rhetorics of politicians, both Democrat and Republican, about cracking down on illegal border crossings and so on and so forth, if you look at actual enforcement at the workplace, because we all know that many migrants, this is an open secret in the US as much as elsewhere in the world, that many migrants, undocumented migrants, do all sorts of jobs that in a way are needed. And at the same time, we turn a blind eye towards that. So the same politicians that talk very sort of in tough terms about we need to crack down on immigration are the same politicians that basically don't enforce labor law. And the statistic that struck me most is the number of employers that get prosecuted on a yearly basis in the US for employing undocumented migrants, roughly between 10 and 15 a year. And that is actually laughable, and it shows that there is no real willingness to do something about it. And to me, it shows the political hypocrisy around the issue. And this is not
Sorry. Could you say that one more time? The number of employers who are prosecuted for violation of the laws is 10, not 10,000, but 10 a year?
Yeah, 10 to 15, something like that. So that is roughly equal to the chance of being hit by lightning. So it is a complete joke. And to me, this is really showing that nobody is discussing about the real issue. Like you were mentioning in the intro, very crudely put, the left is representing immigration as, particularly when you talk about illegal border crossings, representing it as a movement of refugees and desperate people. On the right, it's like an invasion, it's criminals, it's job thieves, and so on and so forth. But nobody talks about the real issue, which is that we actually tolerate the exploitation of undocumented migrants. And we know that many fulfill all sorts of useful roles, and we have them around us. Look at who's cleaning houses, tending to gardens, who's working in slaughterhouses, who is doing all sorts of service jobs in big cities. These are, of course, not all undocumented migrants, but a big share of them are actually. And we basically don't enforce labor law. Yes, 10 to 15 a year, that's all it is. So without any zeros added, and it shows it's actually a complete joke. And it's a form of organized political hypocrisy and across the ideological spectrum. It's not true that Trump necessarily was enforcing labor law more than presidents before or after him. It's been quite consistently low. And it also seems that those statistics are very difficult to get by. So they're generally not even published. And I think it took a Freedom of Information Act request or something like that to get even those figures from the Department of Labor or something like that. So it shows that this is what politicians don't want us to know in a way, because what they say is something completely different than what they do. And this is what we call, as migration researchers, the discursive gap between the tough talk of politicians and what they do or actually don't do in practice.
And earlier, I think you mentioned that the number of temporary migrants, is that the category, under Trump increased substantially?
It actually reached an all-time high under Trump. I mean, it started already under Obama, but it actually reached an all-time high, 7 million, just before the COVID pandemic hit in 2009. So that's, and quite independently from the political color of politicians, we see a quite consistent increase in the number of temporary admissions, going up and down a little bit with the business cycle, but we see a consistently increasing trend. If you go back to the 1990s, around 1 million temporary admissions a year, and if you go back indeed to the final years of Trump, we talk about just under 7 million a year of temporary admissions, which dropped fast after the COVID pandemic, but is picking up right now again. So the reality is that politicians, whether Republican or Democrat, are faced with the same economic imperatives, with the same pressures of employers that push governments to actually open many doors. This is not what you will read in the newspapers. And at the same time tolerate the exploitation of undocumented workers, as I was just mentioning. So the reality of migration is a completely different one than what politicians tell us, but it is both on the Democratic and the Republican side more or less the same story.
Wow. One of the things you pointed out in your book really startled me, and that was what the underfunding of higher education, public higher education, has resulted in. Let me not put, I don't want to put words in your mouth, just lay out what your perception is of that.
Yeah, so one of the fastest growing immigrant categories in the US, apart from workers, both high and lower skilled workers, are students. And what you can actually see is that the US higher education system is increasingly bankrolled by fee-paying foreign students. So let's not blame students in a way for undermining higher education. In many ways, students are bankrolling the US education system, and it is one of the reasons why that number has gone up so fast. Of course, the US has fantastic universities that attract foreign students, but it is also a question of lack of funding. And that is where many academics are worried about in the US. Also in the UK, you see the same thing. And of course, there's a relation with the underfunding and the defunding of higher education, that you make the system increasingly dependent on fee-paying students, and foreign students are willing to pay really high fees. So it makes it a very attractive deal. The question is this sustainable, and is this something we want?
But it also is startling because the discussion of immigration revolves substantially, for good reason, on low-skilled workers and low-paid workers. But at the same time, the discussion of what's happening in higher education is about some of the most privileged of the societies folks come from, and the most privileged of our own societies, college students getting college degrees and going off and getting college jobs. It's fascinating to see the way the demand for one or another group of people is the key issue in your work. It's demand for workers, demand for students, results in policy problems.
It results in the gap, I would say, between what politicians say and what they do. So immigration policies on the ground are much more open than you would think if you listen to politicians. And this is indeed demand driven. It's the education system that likes foreign students for many reasons. Indeed, these are higher skilled jobs, but what many people don't realize, I think, because there is a kind of narrative like we need high-skilled workers, we don't need low-skilled workers. The fact of the matter is that because both the US labor force has become so much better skilled compared with aging, actually has caused a huge crunch in lower skilled jobs. And one of the reasons why illegal border crossings have gone up so massively over the last few years is that we see particularly a crunch amongst lower skilled non-agricultural jobs, where the legal admissions are really low. If you look at agricultural jobs, those admission figures legally have really gone up. But particularly for non-agrarian jobs, all these service jobs that migrants are fulfilling, because we no longer want to do those jobs, we have become more and more double income earning families. The migrants we're getting over from abroad are also higher skilled workers. They need people to take care of their kids. They need people to clean their houses, to tend their gardens. They need people to cook food in the restaurants they would eat in, and so on and so forth. So that is the big paradox, that because we have become so much better skilled, because we get migrants in who get better and better skilled, they create a demand for all sorts of services for lower skilled workers. And the problem is that demand for lower skilled workers is not being accommodated by legal admissions. And that translates itself partly in illegal border crossings. And that dynamic is rarely ever recognized in public debate.
So, in theory, then, if public policy worked to improve the compensation for lower skilled work, several things could happen. First of all, you would have more interest in doing the work among American workers. And how would you see that playing out?
I think it is definitely true that if you would make certain kind of jobs more attractive and would increase the pay and security as well of those jobs, of course you would motivate more local workers to do those jobs. But at the same time we deal with structural changes like aging, which just also means that the amount of people entering the labor market not having higher degrees, still wanting to do those jobs, is going to shrink anyway. But certainly those policies could mitigate at least the sort of soaring demand of these kind of jobs. It could also mean that certain jobs will disappear, or certain jobs will be shipped abroad, because that's another thing we see. But I think the most crucial problem is the care sector, because care jobs are not, you cannot ship abroad care jobs, right? You could do that with industrial production, you could do it even with agriculture. But care is going to be the key issue of the future. Who's going to take care of our elderly? Who's going to take care of our sick and children in the future? And there I think to just bet on immigration is a dangerous one, because the whole world is aging. Many origin countries of migrants themselves are starting to age. The number of countries that are eager to attract those foreign workers, whether nurses, doctors, or lower skilled workers doing in the care sector, is going to decrease globally. And also, wouldn't we want to educate our own workforce as well? So I don't want to create any illusion we can think away immigration, but just the assumption that we solve those problems with immigration, I think that is a complete illusion. We cannot solve aging with immigration. It would require such massive volumes for immigration. It is completely unrealistic. So the issues you are mentioning are serious issues. The feeling that many middle-class people have the feeling that their kids have less opportunities than they had. If we look also at insecurity around healthcare, around housing, growing inequality, job insecurity, these are serious issues. So instead of blaming immigrants for that, we should say, well, we have created a job market that indeed attracts immigrants. And if you want to do something about it, it is not about stopping immigration. It is to pursue serious reforms in terms of our labor laws, compensation, taxation, to make those jobs more attractive. So this is not to think away migration, but it is to say, yeah, there are serious issues at hand, and let's stop blaming immigration and let's start fixing those issues.
I cannot think of a single American public figure who says things remotely like what you're talking about. You pay obviously more attention to the issue than I do. But are there folks we should be aware of, or is there really a dearth?
I mean, for sure there's people, there must be politicians, not that I'm aware of, there is no leading politician, but that's the same in Europe. There is no politician that has the courage to tell the real story about migration, to have a more nuanced story about migration that is neither pro nor anti, and dares to tell a real story. But I believe the time is there. I do believe there is more and more people getting annoyed by the lack of quality we get from politicians in terms of the stories they tell us. The problem is they don't hear any alternative stories. And I think really you see that with other issues as well. If politicians take courage and tell a real story, people will recognize that. And I'm actually encouraged looking at public opinion, because this is a big paradox. You'd think with the sort of ramping up of the anti-immigration narrative, and you see the sort of almost competition between politicians who sounds tougher on border enforcement. If you look at public opinion, the picture is much more nuanced. I also analyzed data in my book, which shows that it is actually not true that the public has turned against immigration. You've always had people who thought more positively about immigration and other people who think more negatively about migration. But actually, people are much more level-headed than politicians about immigration. And if you look at long-term trends, you actually see that the percentage of people who thinks moderately positive about immigration is rather increasing than decreasing, even amongst Republicans, particularly amongst young people. And I think this shows that people are getting used to immigrants in their day-to-day lives. But there is a lack of realistic stories politicians tell about it, because it's either this pro-immigration story, which if indeed you are a local worker in a chicken factory in Alabama doesn't resonate with you, or it is a story about migrants being criminals, basically, which is also not something that resonates with people who really live with migrants. They know the story is a much more diverse one. So we desperately need new stories. We desperately need a new generation of politicians that dares to break through this deadlock. And you've seen this in other policy areas too. I think there could be a new time coming, and this is what I'm hoping for, of course, and this is also why I wrote the book, to say, well, the stories you're hearing on both sides of the debates have very little to do with the real world.
When I read your book, I noticed myself having an emotional reaction. I mean, it's a very logical book. It's very much about economics and sociology and full of argumentation and like that. But the way reading the book is so unsettling, because you disturb the assumptions that I and just about everybody have operated on for a long time, and your arguments are so clear. It's a profoundly unsettling experience, but it's one I'm grateful to you for, because I'm just not going to be able to hear the old debates the same way ever again.
I'm very happy to hear that, because that's what I've been trying to do. I haven't, because it is a reaction of myself as well. I've been researching migration for my whole professional life, the last 30 years basically, as a researcher. And I've become growingly frustrated with my interactions with politicians. Because in the beginning, I still thought, okay, I've got all these findings. I'm finding out different things than we hear in the media. We need to change the policies because the policies actually backfire. And I've always thought, independent of what you think of immigration, whether you want more or less or different immigration, you should be interested in what policies work and what policies don't work. And we actually have evidence of some policies being completely counterproductive, because they don't really understand how migration works, what drives migration, and how you could indeed fix the problems we do have with immigration. And to my astonishment, I discovered over the years that politicians simply won't listen if what you are telling them is not convenient and doesn't fit into their story, whether it's a pro or anti-immigration story. And I gave up hope at some point that I could ever change anything by just talking to policymakers and politicians behind closed doors. I remember one instance, I gave a talk to high-level policymakers, And then after my talk, they came to me and said to me, well, we know you're right, but implementing what you say will be political suicide. And to me, that was in a way the moment I think I decided to write the book, because I thought I need to write a book for a broader audience that tries to explain what a century of migration research has generated in terms of insights for a broader public that is interested in knowing more about the issue. And that really drove me. It's that prime frustration I have myself by the sort of fantasy stories, the myths I'm hearing on both sides of the debate. And so yeah, I'm happy to hear that, because I didn't write the book with the idea of prescribing an opinion, more to generate debate and hopefully to have a more informed debate in the future.
Well, the book is How Migration Really Works by Hein de Haas. I highly recommend it to you, but take it in small doses at first, because it's not like reading a conventional piece of political analysis with arguments that we're familiar with. It is not something you read to confirm everything you believe, which is, of course, 99% of what people read, especially about politics. This will be an unsettling experience, but believe me, you'll profit from it. Thank you for coming on the Political Conversations. Such a delight to meet you. Let's talk again.
Yes, thanks a lot. Okay.
Great to meet you.
Same here. Bye-bye.